Thank you so much for joining us today at our session, Connecting Science and Journalism Through Climate Change and Digital Innovation here in Perugia. My name is Rina. I work for an international research organization called the European Forest Institute, with offices all over Europe. We are organized in two sessions, really looking at the sort of intersection between the journalism and science, with a specific focus on the climate change. I want to give you why we are doing this. So first of all, as a science organization, we believe that there are much more we can do to connect these two communities. We are actually looking at, we have a lot of similarities between science and journalism. And we are looking at facts, we are always looking at evidences. We are also all about independence and the after accuracy and credibility. So we want to connect these two dots. We are connecting to these communities to be able to engage more, to understand what we can do with the climate change topic. And another thing that I'm a long-time participant of the International Journalism Festival here in Perugia, and also previously I've been working in the journalism field in the past 10 years. And then what we noticed that we have been talking a lot about digital innovation, we have been talking a lot about the new approaches, new way to tell stories, but can we link to this, to the topic that everyone in this room are being affected, climate change, that has a lot of different aspects that we can connect. And when we talk about community engagement, we can also connect with the audiences through the topic. So that's the reason why we are also looking at this. And then finally, we really want to see different sort of corners of the story. We tend to focus on risks. When we talk about climate change, when the disaster happens, we always go after that. There's a journalists, storytellers, but can we see it from different point of view, not just only focusing on the climate change, because it's very much interlinked to so many aspects of our life, economy, politics, and also everyday decision making. So in this session, we would like to kind of have a bird point of view, looking at the climate change at the broader perspective, to explore and understand where things are in terms of public understanding and public engagement about the topic. So we're going to be looking at the first half, we'll be looking at the challenges and threats that, when we look at the climate change debate. And then the second half, we'll be more focusing on what are the changes we need, what are the solutions, what can we actually do to change the process. And on that note, I would like to pass it on to my colleague, Elisabetta Attalla.
Thanks, Rita, and good morning, everybody. My name is Elisabetta Attalla. I am a science and data journalist. I come from Italy. I'm currently collaborating with Rina and the European Forest Institute on this process and issue and effort of trying to make scientists and journalists collaborate on a more long term to improve our coverage of climate change. So first of all, on a note of practical organization, we would like to ask you to send questions via Twitter with the hashtag of the festival and global change as hashtag. So global change will be the hashtag, will be searching to collect your questions and put your questions as well to our panel. This is meant to be a very interactive sort of session, so please just really fire your questions and comments, and we will be trying to feed our conversation with our panelists through your questions as well. Of course, there will also be some space for direct questions. We have an amazing panel today, and we're really, really happy. So I want to just tell you very briefly who are our guests. So Victoria Mikute, she's a producer for Contrast Voir, and she works for Al Jazeera. So it's going to be a very on-field sort of expertise we have here. John Riley, co-director of the MIT Joint Program on Global Change. So we have more the science side here, and Alok Shah, a public engagement fellow for the Wellcome Trust, but has more than, I think, 10 years experience on science coverage as well, field coverage. Alan Rusbridger now is like the principal at Lady Margaret Hall, University of Oxford. You know all him also for his long time as the editor-in-chief of The Guardian, and Jonathan Gray, lecturer in critical infrastructure studies at the King's College London, again known at this festival as well for his work on data and data journalism handbook, and I think we will also see him in other panels in these days. So we go straight into, we just like dive into the topic, and I'll start with John Riley. We have asked our guests to focus, first of all, on the problem we're facing, so the challenge, but we really assure you we don't want a whiny session, so we're going to put some of the challenges and problems on the floor and then trying to look at what solutions and strategies we're dealing with. So let's start though with the challenge on what makes you stay awake at night, let's say, when we're dealing and the way we're dealing with climate change coverage and discussion today.
Well, thank you. So my perspective comes a lot from the US, and there the thing that concerns me the most is the deep divisions we see in the country where facts seem not to matter. And of course, as a scientist, I'm a producer of what I think are facts, and if they don't matter to people, then I'm irrelevant. So that's a concern, that if science has become irrelevant to some of these discussions. Social psychologists in the United States have identified some of this issue as kind of people identifying with a tribe, and so the climate change as a hoax or junk science or fake news is part of tribal identity with a set of issues that a group of people seem to have. And so actually penetrating this tribal belief threatens people and their tribal identity. They'll be kicked out or scorned by their tribe. That's a view, one sociology view of how it works. I think we can ask, why is the climate change a tribal issue? Well, one is it's global climate change, and that kind of, people have a lack of control. It's the globe, it's the world. What can I do? Nothing I can do will matter. And so that gives people a sense of helplessness. And also it requires probably central government and a global coordinated response. And for people in this tribe, that kind of threatens their sense of independence, or they're wanting to get government off their back. So the tendency then, I think, is human to just deny the existence of this because it's such a big threat. I can't live with it, so let's just deny the existence. So as I said, it's hard to penetrate this with data, facts, and info, and particularly troubling for scientists. I think we need to appeal to emotions at a personal level and a local level, and that challenges really scientists because our discipline has taught us to remove emotion from the analysis to make it cold, objective facts, and those are the things that don't communicate. And then getting down at the level we need to get to just stretches the ability of science to predict individual events and separate this idea of human-induced climate change from natural variability. So I think that's where, this understanding of how do we as scientists separate the natural events, the natural variability from that's human caused, convince people that there is something there.
Thank you, John. That's already a huge amount of issues on our floor. Alan, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, it's such a huge. I think it's the biggest story in the world, and the potential consequences of climate change probably don't need labouring in a room like this, except that it seems to me a story on which journalism has failed. It is in any rational accounting, the risks of what is likely to happen over the next generation in so many fields is so alarming. The fact that this is not on the front page or leading the bulletins of every news network every week is astonishing and worrying. And it makes you wonder why, and all the reasons are bad reasons, really. It could be to do with ideology, and John's mentioned that I think this is particularly true of the British press, that you've got quite a substantial, I would say, majority of the British press that are not inclined to believe in man-made climate change or the reality or the probability of the consequences of it. So that's a bad reason. It could be the economics of journalism. are just not well suited to a story like this. I increasingly meet editors who are so driven by metrics, and that any story that doesn't meet the particular metric that drives that newsroom then is not going to make the news agenda. And that seems to me a very sort of alarming, self-reinforcing cycle of ignoring this story. It could be that journalism itself is just not well suited to a huge subject like climate change, which journalism likes things that happened yesterday, which you can describe and attribute to a reason. It's very bad at saying, well, this could happen in 20 years' time, or here's the thing that happens yesterday, but we're not sure that we can blame this on climate change. And it could be, I mean, clearly the public themselves, if the public is apathetic about this, you know, to the degree to which journalism can be blamed for that. But that's what journalism should do. Journalism should be finding ways of energizing and dramatizing stories and making them interesting and making the public take interest. But at the moment, the short answer to your question is that you have this enormously threatening, menacing, important story which is just not being covered.
Thank you, Alan. I just want to remind you to fire your questions and comments via Twitter. Okay, we're going to put the hashtag on board, but it's global change. So, okay. Jonathan, your question and challenge.
Yeah, no, I agree that it's a very big story, but I guess I'd emphasise a slightly different frame in a way, which is that the question of how we tell stories about climate change raises a lot of interesting challenges about the way that we imagine the relationship between science, journalism, and democracy, which is, of course, where you know, as a researcher, you could have a field day. You know, but I'll just mention a few of those things which kind of draw on recent research. I think the first thing is it challenges the notion of the public. And this is something that people have been debating about since the early 20th century, people like Walter Lippmann and John Dewey, who suggest that the notion of the public is perhaps not so useful when it comes to thinking about what journalism does and what journalism is supposed to do. And instead, there's kind of shift towards publics who are held together by particular issues that concern them, or by particular arrangements through which they're kind of gathered as a public. And I agree with Alan that there's a sort of tension between the way in which media organizations gather groups as publics through what some have called the industrial construction of the audience, through these different practices of measuring and bundling up attention, which is often, for example, sold to advertisers or used to inform kind of editorial in all sorts of ways, and which, of course, is not entirely unrelated to the question of kind of filter bubbles and tribes. In a sense, if you shift from the public to publics, it raises a lot of sort of interesting questions about what you imagine the contribution to be. I guess the second thing that people have been studying a lot since the 1980s and 1990s is what's called the deficit model. It's the idea that the role of the journalist is to supply people with the facts or with information about climate change. I think that's something that has been widely challenged, and still something we need to kind of keep reminding ourselves is not the only thing that sort of, journalists should be doing. I think the other sort of question is, what do stories about climate change do? What is it we imagine that those stories produce socially? I think that's something that you know, I think about a lot in terms of, even if you kind of have these more complex stories and more interesting stories, what is the contribution of those stories to tackling climate change, and how is that supposed to work? I guess as well, there is a kind of tension between the phenomenon of climate change as a very complex, kind of multi-layered phenomenon, and the values of the news, including things like recency and the temporality of a story and how it unfolds and how you kind of find threads within it that you can use to select and narrate aspects of this very complex issue in a way which kind of fits with the news cycle. something that we've seen a lot, I guess, more in the last decade than in this one, is this kind of question of balance. It challenges different editorial practices of trying to kind of give sort of equal column inches to different sides of an issue, which I think we often found was disproportionate if you compared the column inches that we'd be giving to climate skeptics to, for example, their role in the scientific literature or in relation to kind of key sources. And I guess finally, there's a kind of question of how one, on the one hand, tells stories about kind of climate science, which is made powerful by taking only very small aspects of the world, whether it's kind of temperature change or kind of species diversity, and it's reducing sort of the phenomena that makes it kind of very powerful. Yet at the same time, you miss out many things, as John was saying, whether it's kind of culture or sort of the social or political context of these studies. But
thank you, Jonathan. Alok, from your point of view, with your experience as a reporter and journalist, so which are the major problems?
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to just build on some of the things we've heard already. I mean, I agree with a lot of the sectoral challenges and the failures in journalism that we've heard about. And I'll lay out a couple of challenges that I think that we face in reporting on climate change and making people engaged with it. One is, what worries me most about the current state of public understanding of climate change? Well, it's the fact that climate change is complex and nuanced, and journalism is neither of those things. I have spent a long time talking to scientists about how they can get their news into journalism, and I would always start with that. Science is deliberate, it's objective, it's incremental, it's slow, it's self-referential, and it's careful. Journalism is almost none of those things. It's the direct opposite. But having said that, this is the format we have for news, and so if you want to get on board, then this is how you do it. I'm largely believing now that actually we need to, and journalism, start to change how we do this. So we exist, if you're a specialist journalist, like I've been for a long time, you operate within a certain set of formats in mainstream news, whether it's news or features or documentary, that exist, that have been created for very different types of stories to the ones that we're having to tell now. We've not innovated in those formats. We've not created new ones, new storytelling narratives. We've not created new, you've not used technology to give the impressions of complexity and nuance that I think that the public deserves. So my challenge is, can we as journalists spend a bit of time, maybe a small percentage of our time, thinking how to reframe the kinds of stories we want to tell, rather than just forcing them into the narratives that were created a century ago for politics and argumentation on that front. They don't work for the sort of global level societal challenges that we face now. And I don't just mean climate change. I'm talking about antimicrobial resistance. I'm talking about artificial intelligence. These are complex technological stories that require people to have a deep understanding, not at the sort of level of like the actual scientists themselves, but at least an understanding that there is complexity there, and that complexity is not something to be shied away from. I've not met a single news editor in my life who's ever said to me, "Oh, look, yeah, make that story more complex." It's not going to happen. But are there ways of bringing news or nuance into it? I don't have an answer, but I want journalists of all stripes to start thinking about how we do this. Can we do some R&D? Can we try some experiments? And it doesn't mean that we have to somehow come up with some massively new format that involves, dancing on the ice poles or something. It simply could mean, can we think about how to bring audiences in at a much earlier level so that they have more transparency about what we're doing, who have more direction of what we journalists are doing? Can we allow them to direct some of the journalism that we do so that we're answering their questions rather than just the questions that we think they want to know? There are an infinite number of questions we could ask each other. I feel like journalists just never do this, and I feel like we should. The problem with not explaining uncertainty and nuance and all that complexity is all around us. With climate change, there are lots of uncertainties about what happens, what can be attributed and what can't be attributed to large-scale changes. And those shades of grey, which are very comfortable for scientists to talk about, mean that for the rest of us, there are lots of people who can use the sort of shadows to sort of make things up and not believe in facts. So that's the cost. So if we journalists don't improve our storytelling and our formats, these are the costs that we have. And I've got more ideas, but we'll come to them later.
where we will have time, hopefully, to bring more and more ideas. Victoria, from your point of view.
Yeah, so what has been keeping me awake at night is how to explain a very complex issue in my 4 to 5 minute virtual reality documentary. And so what I do, I create virtual reality documentaries, and I'm a part of Contrast VR, which is Al Jazeera's in-house media studio. We launched only last year in April 2017. And what stories we tell stories of the communities from Global South, from the developing world, and through people who are innovating, who are striving and to bring about change in those communities. So we were very excited to collaborate with European Forest Institute to actually tell the story, to do a story on climate change through people that are actually affected by it. And we benefited from EFI, from scientific expertise and context, and what they benefit from us is, you know, the skill set, the skills how to tell the stories and how to tell these human-centered stories. And I want to show the trailer of the documentary that I've been working on, which is about the disappearing oases of Morocco. So let's take a look. You will see a flat image, so it's not a 360 mode, but let's just imagine how it would look like if you would put a virtual reality headset and you would see it in like a 360 space. So let's take a look and let's see how, and then I will tell you what are my challenges.
هاد الواحة هي اللي شاداني هنايا وهي اللي كتجيب لي القوت ديال العيش ديالي باش كناكل. هذاك الشيء دابا ديال البلاد تصح مشات مسكين على عند سيدي ربي وهاد الساعه قلالت ما بقى والو كطيح عليك في واحد الوقت اللي غير مناسبه.
كنحس بانه كاينه واحد لانجستيس. حنا في هذه المناطق ما كنخلقوش هاد المسببات ديال التغيرات، حنا غير اون سوبي. كل عام انت كدوز في واحد البلاصه كتشوف الصحراء كتزاد، كتشوف الرمله كتزاد كتدخل، يعني كتخوى من بنو ادم. ملي ما يكون بنو ادم راه صافي، راه هذاك هو العنصر اللي يمكن يحبس لك التصحر.
تضوي كيف القمرة واللي شافك يا برام، تضوي كيف القمرة واللي شافك يا برام.
So it really hasn't been an easy task to explain such a complex issue as we're saying. Even here, like climate change is one of the causes of oases disappearing, and then there are so many other causes. And I've been talking to many researchers about it. And always, I was reading a lot of studies and papers, and the difficulties I found, I always asked them, please explain this to me. Please talk to the language that I would explain, and I could translate this to my audience, because there is this gap, and the language is really difficult to understand as being a journalist, especially the one who doesn't cover climate change all the time. And we had to make so many cuts. I always made a new cut, and I would show it to my colleagues, to my senior producers, and I would ask, do you understand the issue? Is it all clear? And there would always something come up, no, there's something missing. We have to explain this. We have to include that issue. We have to include that text and all that kind of stuff. So it's been really challenging how to make it engaging, informative, factual, and also, you know, to tell the story that everyone would understand and everyone would care about it.
Thank you, Victoria. So if we can see, I think we can have the hashtag. I've been told global change is too busy, and so please, can you use this hashtag to fire your questions? And so we will try to collect them and start using them in the conversation. But as we promised, we want now to turn from the problem and challenge and start to look into how we can actually tackle these problems and how we can try to respond. And maybe a lot of key words already came up, like trying to be more integrated or trying to be more transparent and so on. But I'll just give John back the microphone to start and see what's your view of how we can try to turn this problem into something that we are dealing with in a proper way.
So I guess I'm kind of struck by just the conversation that, you know, what is the role of journalism? Is it really to inform or drive us to some conclusion, or is it just to inform us about debates that are going on? So I guess the question is, how much of the responsibility for informing people is journalist responsibility, or what are the different forms of journalism that could be helpful? I think Elizabeth's work seems to be driven very directly by this sort of thing, making the problem personal, connecting to people, and it's hard work, as you suggest, because it's not easy for scientists or for you. I think, you know, drawing from the news of the hour, right, we're concerned about war in Syria, and there is this kind of debate going on, can the US respond in some broad way with an aerial attack? We know those don't work, and I think climate change, we have to be worried that we can't expect a kind of an aerial attack, broad international journalism to give a story or two and that convince everyone. It is a ground game. It's boots on the ground, if you will. Reporters working in all parts of the world, getting trust of their audience and trust of local people and connecting. So I think it's a big war effort, and if we go in only with half the resources, then we aren't going to come out successful, is my sense. But
before I pass on to Alan, John, can you just give us a very quick word on the fact that you are working, like if you've done a lot of experience of actually talking to people directly, local communities, so maybe that's also a process that can help, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we go into local communities in the United States and talk about, it's an area affected by coastal climate change, the sea level is rising, people can connect to that because they see it as their problem and they see ways in which the local community can respond to it. The hard thing is connecting that back, I think, as was said earlier, how does that connect back to whether we should really slow greenhouse gases, because this community doesn't have control over that. So connecting this complex issue of a small issue back to the global issue and making it all integrate is, I think, the challenge.
Alan, what's your view on that? How can we improve this process?
Well, just a couple of things which we can broaden out for discussion. So the first was a piece of advice from Bill McKibben, who will be known to some of you, who was a journalist and is now a campaigner. And his advice to me when I was editing was, stop treating this as a climate change story. You have this in a ghetto of coverage, and we've moved beyond climate change. So take it beyond the environmental reporters and make all your reporters cover this beat. So this is a story about security, it's a story about immigration, it's a story about food, it's a story about sport, it's a story about politics, certainly a story about economics. So all these people ought to be covering this story and stop covering it as a climate change. We know the science, and the more you make it look as though the science is something that's up for debate, the more you're going to have this as a ghetto. So I think that was a good piece of advice, and if he had told me that earlier in my career, I would have taken heed of it. And the second thing is that right at the end of when I was editing, we decided to do a campaign around this, because I think if there was too much of a sense of fatalism that you read these stories about which it looked as though you could do nothing as a reader. So this terrible thing is about to happen to me. I feel too depressed. I can't even really bear to read about it because it's so frightening. And so we did a big campaign. We called it Keep It in the Ground. And it was really putting the onus back on the reader and saying, well, there are things you can do about your pensions and about disinvesting from fossil fuels. And you can put pressure on your college, your pension scheme, your workplace. And that did seem to be a technique that got people interested again in this subject. And watching that campaign now ripple out across campuses and faith organizations and charities and a program of divestment. I'm not saying that was all to do with our story, but nevertheless it was a way of dramatizing a story that people, I think, had stopped reading and given the reader some agency in it.
Thank you, Alan. I think before we go with Jonathan, we have a few questions that are coming up and comments, right? So we can put them on the floor and comment them.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot. So one question was about how do we make people value more of this huge problem, climate change, when fake news and royal families' newborns make more clicks and views? There's another one, what approaches in data journalism have most successfully enabled reporting of complex global issues and which have, in your mind, failed? I'm not sure if there's anyone who can respond to that. There's another comment saying that can we connect more to like the climate change topic to its consequence of our near world, such as climate migrants, conflicts, social inequalities. Just a comment.
I think, Jonathan, you have a challenge here. Try to include include this and go forward. Yeah.
I'm going to mention 4 things, and I think very conveniently they kind of intersect a little bit with some of the questions anyway. But I'll leave it there, and then we can have more space for discussion. I guess I'm going to mention 4 opportunities, 4 things that I'm excited about, which don't just keep me awake at night because I'm worrying, but keep me excited about things, sort of sites of experimentation, as it were. The first is, while the power of a lot of the scientific research has been to decontextualize what we were talking about earlier, things like temperature, species diversity, and to render those things comparable across space and time, to pick up these big trends and patterns. That's tremendously exciting. At the same time, I think I'm also excited about this kind of turn towards bringing the social, political, and cultural contexts of climate change back into the story. And I guess just to kind of illustrate a little bit what I mean by that, even things like the IPCC debates, they're tremendously rich and interesting when you study sort of the negotiation process to see how all of these different interests converge and are managed and kind of coordinated through the negotiations process. So there's a project called Climaps, which I think you can find at climaps.eu, which is a kind of project undertaken by several of my colleagues, which looks at everything from the kind of mapping topics across the IPCC debates and how they kind of change over time, even looking at things like climate fiction or kind of cli-fi, as I think it's called, which is kind of gives you all these different imaginaries about sort of big kind of climatic event, but also things like assessing vulnerability. How do you assess the vulnerability of a country and allocate funding? I mean, there was this big claim, I think a few years ago, that there was this kind of shift from the idea of mitigating climate change or finding out ways of stopping it to adapting to it. And you see that reflected in some of these debates about how money is allocated. And I think surfacing these different sorts of matters of concern, surfacing these kinds of political questions is probably going to remain quite important, and not to feel like those things are being bracketed and sort of in discussing kind of, you know, sort of the big questions about temperature change and sort of parts per million. You don't lose some of that kind of historical and cultural and political context. And indeed, I think Alan and his colleagues at The Guardian did a nice job of that when they were looking at carbon emission trends over time. We're just looking at a piece called, I think it's Carbon Emissions Past, Present and Future. And that shows a little bit over time, since the sort of Industrial Revolution, how different countries kind of emitted sort of over time. So that's the first. Sorry, the second is, and I'll be quicker. There's a tremendous potential for visual and storytelling formats for making sense of this issue and finding different ways to experience it. And I think that, you know, even just take the very simple conventions like graphs. I think there's been a huge amount of interesting work in data journalism and digital journalism, looking at how you can annotate and draw attention to different aspects of the visual representation of data, how you sequence that, which is extremely interesting to explore for communicators and other people doing public engagement work around science. I guess the third thing is actually in the wake of all of these big scientific controversies around things like you know, leaked emails and sort of climate skepticism, I actually think it's a really nice opportunity to bring in narratives about what you could even kind of consider the fragility of science, how science is actually something that requires work, time, reflection. You know, there's all of this labor involved in the production of a fact. A fact isn't something that just immediately stands by itself And I think, and indeed, it's not self-evident, and I think that's partly the point. So surfacing the labour involved in science, I think, is a really nice thing to kind of gradually bring into the story, particularly vis-a-vis scepticism, in fact, because I think then you start to see the asymmetry between different sorts of facts which are produced in this sort of debate. And the final thing is not just kind of the provision of information and analysis, but also different forms of interactivity and engagement. So how, for example, data sources or stories can assemble groups together in ways that perhaps might be different from climate skepticism as tribal marker, to see how different people might engage and interact with the issue through digital technologies and through different storytelling techniques. And I guess I'm thinking here particularly of things like recent experiments around air quality, where you kind of do things like data walks, or this, you kind of use sensor technologies, and that's, there's interesting ways in forming and assembling publics around the issue. But,
thank you. And Alok, on the note of engagement, I think there are lots of things that you're also looking into in terms of how to change a bit the way we report about climate change.
So I think there are two ways to look through this. Yeah. No, it's okay. There are two ways to sort of come up with solutions to this. We've heard about here's lots of information out there, how can we communicate it better, which I think is a really important way of the standard journalistic process, to say, look, there are all these other sources of information, how do you make it meaningful to people? And I think that's important. But for me, what I'm interested in at the moment, and I think we should be more interested in as journalists, is to look from the other end of this telescope, which is that I really want people to be empowered and engaged. So you start from that position, you think, well, what will make them empowered and engaged about a topic like this? And one way of finding out is to ask people. And I don't think that we as journalists do that very much. I don't mean market research in the sense of, do you like this article or do you not? But simply allowing people to have conversations about climate change, ethnographies, if you will, watching what they're talking about, what they're misunderstanding, what they care about, and then using that in your decision-making to then go forward with journalism. So there's a good example of this with a website called al.com, which is a main sort of news website in the southern United States. And they wanted to cover healthcare slightly differently to the rest of their colleagues. And so they had the people in Washington doing all the Congress politics stuff. But then they also sent 3 or 4 reporters out into the field to sit in truck stops, ride along with truck drivers, sit in cafes, just listening to people talking about healthcare, maybe asking a question or two, but nothing for reporting quotes. They came back a few weeks later to their editors and had essentially a whole list of misunderstandings, gaps in knowledge, an understanding of what people actually cared about when it came to healthcare. And then they commissioned a series of articles and stories and so on based on those things. Now, that's not radically complicated. You're not creating some sort of new interactive format or something. You're still writing stories and making videos and those sorts of things. But the commissioning process was very different. I think with climate, we can do something similar. We can ask people what they actually care about. Or, in fact, if you want to be more better social scientists than that, you have to work out what they care about even if they don't tell you. So you're not asking directly questions. I think that asking people what they want, involving them perhaps in the decisions you make around the content you're producing is good. It makes your process much more transparent, more trustworthy, both things we need in a time when people don't trust anything they read, or they don't trust experts, or whatever you want to believe. When facts are negotiable, I think that all of that is useful if you can bring them behind the curtain with you, especially groups that may not read what you're doing normally, and actually engage with them at an earlier stage. I think that's a very powerful way of building audience, building transparency, and building trust in something like this. Plus also, I'm sad to say that as specialist journalists, we don't know everything about the subject. We will genuinely get new lines of inquiry, new stories from actually asking our audience what to do.
Thank you, Alok. So, Victoria, I think on this note, you can actually share also your experience of going and listening to the community in this case, right?
Yes, that's true. I also want to talk a little bit before then about technology, and we were talking about the new ways of telling the stories. And so I want to think like whether actually technology can help us. And Virtual reality is one of the ways that we actually can see those changes, and I think it's very powerful to transport the viewer to those faraway places, because those communities that really are affected by climate change most of the time are really far away, far to reach, somewhere in the rainforest, somewhere in the desert, you know, Amazon, somewhere. So it's a really powerful tool, and we should use it. But what's happening, it's still the story, it's most important. And even if I'm doing the story in VR, the visuals are very powerful, and I think they really show what's going on. The story is still the most important, and it's still challenging. So my point of how to make it more engaging and interesting, it's still very valuable, even if we find more innovative ways to telling these kind of stories. So, but about talking with people and actually going into those communities. So what I think that most of the time climate change stories are too sensationalized, in a sense that we care about them only when disasters get hit and when it becomes a world news story and all the media is covering some event somewhere, and then we all discuss, oh wow, maybe it's really something changing, and we start digging into facts and talking to scientists when these events happen. But I think we should focus on the communities. We should shift the focus and actually cover those communities that are affected by climate change every day, and their daily life really is connected to those changes and to those things. As, for example, we saw the farmer in the documentary, Habib, he's actually telling that the rain is sporadic, and he's really he cannot find water. They're actually showing us the places, and they're saying how it was only 10 years ago, how many trees were around, how it was totally different, and how they're actually a fear for the future. So what happens when we talk to those people, we also can ask what they do to change their situations. And the solutions that they have come up with are very important and should be important to us as somebody, as journalists, as scientists. So I think getting these solutions from local communities, from people, and then we can actually think about long-term participatory approach, how to solve it on the global scale. And that's what we try to do in Contrast. We try not to just cover the story, but also ask people and show people who are bringing about change, trying to do something. Because that's what they were telling me in Morocco as well. We are doing these things, and we can advise what we think could be right. Like the one person was saying us, we want to save every drop of rain. We want to do it, and we need help from the science community, from media that would come cover us, that somebody would see what's happening here, and we find the solutions together. And they said we cannot do it alone because it's a global change, right? So I think that's very important to actually learn from those people on the ground, and we need to do it every day, not only when a disaster hits and all the journalists are running to some place to cover and ask people how they feel about it.
Thank you, Victoria. I think we have some more questions.
Yeah, actually, Alok and Victoria touched upon that. But yeah, some of you are talking about climate change as a science story, others as a community story. Can you go around the panel and then have each say how they want climate change should be covered and why? Maybe we can, because I think Alok and Victoria touched upon that, so maybe we can cover that. And then if there's any questions, we're also gathering questions from the room as well.
Yeah, we could collect a couple of questions. Yeah. Okay,
so thank you, Rina, and thank you, the panel, for the great start of the discussion. So I have two comments here, basically. So when we talk about interacting with the audience, there are many ways to do that. And there's one startup company called Harken, H-E-A-R-K-E-N, Harken. Maybe some of you know it already. They work with different media outlets to dig user comments and the questions, the reader comments, where a reader asks a question under an article which has been actually ignored for some reason, but nowadays some outlets really want to try getting story ideas from the readers. So that's one way of interacting with the audience, and I find it quite interesting. And another comment is there is this UNFCCC's momentum for change, where they reward communities, local communities, on different types of local climate solutions, mitigation solutions that they come up with in fashion or anything. And when I approached certain outlets as a freelancer, it was difficult to get those stories out. So we may need opportunities for that.
Thank you. We have 2 or 3 more. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Is this working? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is James Painter, Reuters Institute. James Painter, Reuters Institute. I have about 25 questions, but I'll keep it to one comment and one question. So the comment, I think, great. You've covered a vast array of topics, but my recommendation would be, next time you do it, why don't we have a business editor or a health correspondent on the panel saying, explaining why they do or don't cover the issue. I think it would be in some ways an incredibly helpful addition to these very helpful comments. There's a lot of evidence from the literature that if you give readers solutions rather than doom and gloom, you're going to get more engagement, although that's contested by some. The extraordinary fact about journalism is that there's very few pieces that combine both analysis of the problem and solutions. And I'm just wondering whether that's possible for journalists to include solutions. So at the end of articles, say, by the way, there's something you can do about this. It's not all doom and gloom. And secondly, just on the polarization issue that John mentioned, I think the real issue for journalism in the UK and the US and Australia, where climate change is very polarized, is how do you get narratives that appeal to a right-leaning audience, that break down this polarization? Because the harsh reality is that climate change, unfortunately, is a Guardian reader topic, and it's not a right-leaning topic. So what are the narratives? That's where we have to have a much better debate that can appeal to right-leaning audiences in those countries where it's heavily polarized. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I think we have 2 more questions, and then we go back to the panel for a round of comments and answers.
See, hi, my name is Tosca Valentina. I am a scientist and a journalist together. So I agree with the pieces that talk about solutions so that they can give hope. So that was one comment. The other comment was about how about to include talking about risks when you have to explain uncertainty in scientific data, because risk is something that people may be they may know better than the uncertainty that it's used in the scientific debate. So that could be one way to do. And then my question is, but it's something that sometimes I ask also myself, who are we writing for? For the communities, for the managers, for the policymakers? What is the objective of what we write? How can we be more effective? What do we want to achieve with our pieces? So do we want to educate someone about an issue? So we want to let them know how a climate model works? Or we want to them start doing something? So, because sometimes for example, I am also working on the issue of plastic pollution, and I ask myself, is it better to tell everybody don't take a plastic bottle, or go to a policymaker and push to have laws that forbid to produce plastic bottles? So this is a reflection. I would like to have your comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there is a last one that we can collect, if you can.
Oh, so
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No? Okay. So thanks for interesting discussion. I'm a scientific journalist, freelance journalist from Switzerland, one of the richest countries in the world, and I think the awareness about climate change is quite high in Switzerland. But fighting climate change means also changing one's lifestyle, which is unpleasant. For instance, flying less, eat no meat, and sometimes it's depressing to see you cover a story and nothing changes afterwards. I mean, not directly from the story, but taking, for instance, flying, I think this is quite simple to understand that flying is bad for climate change. But still, I think the numbers goes up, especially also in Switzerland. So just taking a step backwards,
okay.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think we have Sorry, we have a lot of hints and questions and comments. I ask each of you of maybe pick one or two and do a round of comments because we're getting to the end of the session. I just want, yeah, we have 10 minutes, I know, so we might have time for a round and maybe a couple of answers. I also want to stress the point that this is not like a session that's going, I mean, it's ending today, but the process we started, it's really a discussion process. We want to keep open, and we'll probably let you know afterwards. Like, we want to post on the on all of our sites and maybe on the festival website a post with all the ideas we collected and ask you to keep this conversation going. But I just go back and do the round. John.
So I guess I'm struck by one of the questions, who are we writing for? And I think there is this issue we've seen. Are you reporting about science to people, or are you reporting on what's happening to people for decision makers? So I mean, when we see war stories or hunger or poverty stories, if they don't enter the news, they often don't enter the discussion at all. So I think there's a big role for reporters in different places, as you've been doing, to kind of highlight the personal hardship that people are having, and that brings attention to not only to scientists, so you're communicating to science as much as you're communicating to science. So I think that's fantastic. I think the kind of what would I like to see journalists do, I think, you know, I agree completely with Alan's sort of point that we need to wrap this into every component of stories. It affects everything, and it needs to be integral to those parts of the stories. We've done that on our own website to not talk about climate change, but talk about food, water, forestry, energy, natural ecosystems, urban air pollution, health, those sorts of things. So I think wrapping it into the everyday life and connecting that to people is really critical. I was also kind of, I thought around your riff about, I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and there the news on public policy is reported as the fate of personalities in Washington. So you never really read about the news. You read about what's happening to this cabinet secretary or that congressman, and then the story is about that. So I guess it's kind of interesting to think that can that be a draw to people about climate change, reading about the docudrama of personal and how science evolves. That'd be kind of an interesting story. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. Alan, I'll go in the same round. So.
Okay, let me try just very quickly four of those things that have come up. So the first is about clicks, and it touches on what I said earlier about metrics. If you work in a newsroom where, to take one example I heard recently, the only metric is what drives subscriptions. It's the only metric for whether you can cover a story or a genre of story. Then climate change is probably not something you're going to cover. So I think we have to think about what are the metrics that we set for our newsrooms and for journalism. On James's question about narratives, I think it would really make Paul Dacre interested in this subject if he just wrote about immigration. If you think the pressure on immigration is bad now, just imagine what the pressure on immigration is going to be like in 10 years' time as drought hits Morocco and North Africa. On risk and data, a question about that, the answer seems to me obvious. In newsrooms, you have to have more people like Alok in newsrooms, people who can do their sums, and more people like Simon Rogers, who used to work for The Guardian, now at Google, who can visualize and work with data. And there are not enough people who are numerate and who have scientific training working in newsrooms. And finally, just on the question about nuance and complexity, I imagine there's going to be a lot of kicking of social media over the next few days. But there's an awful lot of nuance and complexity in social media. I'm terribly struck by how I now listen to so many podcasts, because podcasts will allow people to talk for 45 minutes, for an hour, in the way that the BBC simply won't nowadays. There's an awful lot of highly trained expert people on social media who simply won't let people get away with the kind of things and the sloppiness and dishonesties in this subject that would have passed unnoticed 10 years ago. So I think we ought to celebrate the role of social media in that too.
Thank you, Alan. Jonathan.
So I'm going to talk about one of my sort of little pet obsessions at the moment, which I use for teaching a lot, which is Italo Calvino, the writer, just before he died, wrote a series of lectures on writing. And the first lecture was on lightness and the virtues of lightness, and how it's very tempting to think about bringing complexity, bringing richness. And when he was younger, he always used to kind of try and tell stories that would kind of bring all this kind of complexity. But there's also a kind of virtue of the way he puts it, kind of subtracting weight from characters, from cities, from heavenly bodies, all this kind of thing. But I guess the thing that excites me here is there are many different ways of doing that. There's many different ways of subtracting weight from an issue to draw attention to different parts of the story. So I guess one thing that excites me is telling different sorts of stories about climate change, which on the one hand, can be things like digital interactives and VR and some of these other forms of experimentation. But I think what's exciting, if you are a journalist and you're kind of trying to cover this area, is that it also need not be expensive, it need not be time-consuming, but attending to different aspects of the situation beyond the kind of sort of familiar stories, I think is an interesting place to experiment. And of course, in that regard, we will need a plurality of different approaches to telling these stories. And just to give kind of one example from colleagues in Paris, they're kind of, how do we rethink this kind of big story from kind of the land towards the globe and the kind of failure of globalization in many ways, and to look at our interdependency in other ways. How do we narrate that from kind of production and sort of supply chains to how we kind of think of how carbon emissions are allocated to nation states and this kind of thing. And I guess the final thing on that front I would say is, as John I think was alluded to right at the beginning, also really paying attention to other sorts of stories about climate change and how this can also play into other sorts of questions of political identity and act as kind of tribal markers. I think following even things like misinformation, so-called fake news, and seeing the significance of those ways of identifying with sort of climate change debates and different ways of narrating is really important.
Thank you. So we still have 2 minutes each, Alok and then Victoria, so we're doing a quick round. Alok.
Thanks, Lisbetta. James, it's almost like you've read my notes, or rather helped me write them. The thing is that I agree with you about solutions, and this is something that I've become very interested in. Solutions. The Solutions Journalism Network is here, the representatives are here, where you talk about a story from the point of view of a solution, and it can be done, it's empowering, and it gets people to see things that I don't think they would see otherwise. So not just go somewhere and say, oh, this is terrible, isn't it? But rather talk about a solution that's going on there and use that as the net framing for describing that problem in the first place. I think that's a fantastic and empowering way of doing things, and it's proving more and more successful. There's a podcast the World Service has launched recently called People Fixing the World, which is essentially this. People have taken solutions-focused journalism in different directions, in different places, but I encourage you to find those things and build on them as journalists. Don't just report the problem. I think you can report the problem in the third paragraph, have the solution at the top. I'm a big fan of that. On the question of the divide, the ideological divide, the usual way of thinking about that has been to frame this as a more than science topic. This is, as Alan said, a business story, a science, a politics story, and a sports story. The one issue with that is that you do get into the politics of personality, as John said. I've done a number of times that stories that I think are important climate stories are taken over by political correspondents who are only concerned about which MP they're going to be pissing off or not. It's quite depressing. So yes, carry on with all that, and I think that's important that we spread these stories out and they're not in the ghetto of science. But I think there's a step we can take backwards from that, which is simply, once again, I'll say this, and I'm sorry if I'm a stuck record, let's ask those people what they want to read and what they care about. Let's find out what they care about and do those stories, not just doing all from our own newsrooms.
Thank you, Alok. Victoria.
So I think what I mentioned before, that showing effects, how it affects communities, is still the most important way, because this is how we relate as audience, as human beings, to other human being who is suffering and who can tell how their daily lives look like. And when we make people care about those stories, then we can include the facts and slip in the facts, and then make this people will remember those facts. Maybe they will go to look for more stories. How how these facts, the changes affect other people in other regions. So that's really important. And to the question, what's our audience, and if we tell story to the global audience, does the same story stick to policymakers? So I think the answer is yes, because if the story is really strong, powerful, and the way of telling that story is really powerful, you can reach policymakers as well. And for example, one of our documentaries about Rohingya refugees, we showcased the virtual reality documentaries at the UN Security Council to the policymakers. And what they said, that actually they read a lot of news about Rohingya refugees. They're always reading, they're always hearing about it. But they said actually seeing that story with your own eyes made them understand it even better. So we have to look for these ways, and we have to making these stories powerful and trying to find these new ways to make these stories maybe even more powerful, and bringing them to global audience and to these policymakers and to scientists and everyone to bridge the gaps between, because policymakers are also detached, so we have to bridge the gaps and we have to look for these ways.
So thank you all for your contribution, and I hand over to Rina for the final remark.
Yeah. Thank you so much for staying around. Just a quick announcement. So if you want to follow and then come up, come join us to, for this conversation, we have a session at 2 o'clock. If you can put it on the screen. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so we have at 2 o'clock, we have a session at the Sala Priori, focusing on the challenges that the climate change reporting is facing. And then we want to have this very interactive session together with you to gather some of the ideas for solutions that we identify as challenges around the climate change reporting. And if you want to follow the debate, if you can make sure to keep this hashtag, that'd be really great. And on a final note, we are supporting journalists who want to experiment with innovative storytelling using climate change, focusing on the climate change. So if you're interested in getting small grants from us, of course, the editorial independence is all due to you. It'd be really good if you can come back to me. And then thank you so much, Elisabetta, Victoria, John, Alok, Alan, and Jonathan for joining us. And thank you guys.